All right, so today's lesson is going to be about Sass. So Sass is a CSS preprocessor, and if you don't know what that means, it's perfectly fine because I will tell you. Let me share my screen really quickly. Okay, so here is totally my presentation. This just was a really great presentation. This is how I learned Sass, and it's really well thought out. So we're going to be using this. It's not copyrighted, so we can. So Sass, and by the way, just to give credit, I guess this is built by Mike North, part of Frontend Masters. He's an engineer at LinkedIn. He has an online course on Sass and super great. So I recommend going there to learn more about Sass, but today we'll just be learning the basics. We started a bit late, but we'll still go until 8 Pacific time. So why use not CSS? Well, if you've used CSS for a long time, it does kind of suck. It has weak points. There's a lot of things you wish you could have, but you don't have. So that's where CSS preprocessors come in. And here you can see how CSS just kind of not it sometimes. It is hard. It is weird. So that's why CSS came into existence that's why CSS preprocessors came into existence is mine. Because you want something a bit better than CSS. All those features you want on CSS, such as nesting, variables, actual logic, is what you can do with a preprocessor. And all these preprocessors, such as Sass or Less or Stylus, you can kind of see right here, they all compile to CSS, they all have variables, they're more modular, and they plug into your existing tools. For example, if you're using CSS in a React project and you're importing styles.css, all you have to do is change it to styles.scss, which you will see is the extension for Sass. And then it's pretty much the exact same thing, but you have a lot more power in your CSS files. So yeah, it's a lot faster to do. Nesting is a big thing. And the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, huge one that also all these preprocessors kind of hit, that you don't need to repeat your CSS as much. Where if you've had a lot of experience with CSS, you know that you repeat a lot of CSS. You don't really have to, and that's where Sass comes in. So here's kind of the roadmap for today. We'll try and hit at least the first two, though all these materials and this entire course is public if you want to see all of them. Yeah, this is just some stuff about people who work on Sass, not super important for our purposes. One thing I will touch on is that there is technically 2 file extensions for Sass. There's SCSS and Sass. They both have their own oddities. You can see here there's no semicolons, there's no brackets. What's used commonly is SCSS because SCSS looks like CSS a lot more than .sass does. And so that's what most people use. Sass is gradually also being phased out, so you should all use the SCSS extension. And you really don't need to worry about the Sass extension. They're both Sass, but they have different little nuances that we don't need to worry about. So yeah, terminology, you guys already noticed from the CSS lessons. Yeah, so to start with Sass, the real power of a CSS preprocessor is nesting CSS. So here you have some HTML, right? That makes this super cool. And normally you'd have to have a container with all your styles, and you'd have a sidebar, and you'd have like a main thing that works, right? This also works. This is still regular CSS, and it's a lot better than this. So that's one improvement you can make. But you still don't want to repeat yourself, like right here, .container. That's one really easy example of repeating yourself. So here's an example of equivalent Sass. You have your container, and here what this means is if you have an element with class sidebar inside of an element with class container. So we go back up here and see that sidebar and main are inside container. This tells that only if sidebar and main are in container, then apply these styles. So if you have container and then main, then apply these styles. For example, if you had a div called main with a class main, and then completely separately, you had a div called container, this would not apply because this CSS only applies when there's a container main inside of container. This doesn't make sense so far. All right, nothing in the chat. In that case, I'll just keep on going. Yeah, some common things that Sass kind of fixes is spelling mistakes. I don't know if you caught that the first time, but just not repeating yourself also leaves less room for error and more room for logic. And basically what the equivalence of CSS and Sass is. So if you have CSS with 2 different classes, .container, .left area, like here, representing this HTML, you can kind of nest it. So it's a lot more reusable, for example, instead of just having to do it just for this one instance. or just general instances. And it's a lot easier to read and stuff because it's nested inside and it's more reusable. So those are the main kind of surface level advantages of using a preprocessor like Sass. I know Sass shares a lot of similarities with Less if you've ever used it, but we're gonna be focusing on Sass just because it's a lot more popular right now. Yeah, another CSS rule that can be transferred to Sass is a direct descendant. So let's say you moved left area to the bottom of this, so it wouldn't, or left area inside of other thing is what I mean. You can see here that direct descendant means this only applies to classes left area that are direct descendants of container. So you do that with just an arrow in CSS, but here you can put that right before left area in Sass. And that's just a general rule. If you're going to do something in CSS that's kind of before a class, like in between two classes, like left area is a direct consent of container, you can just do it right before the class in Sass because it's nested. You normally don't need to like have two classes on the same line in Sass, like you sometimes have in CSS like this, unless you want to apply multiple CSS rules to multiple classes. So you can still do like dot left area dot other thing, comma, if you want to apply like the same CSS rule to both, but typically you do a lot less of it than in regular CSS. So that's one advantage right there. And the parent selector is another one in addition to direct descendant. So we go back up here. So here, what this means is you have dot right nav and dot container, like you have right here, and then apply this rule. However, if you want it and, just throw an ampersand in there and dot right nav. It's a lot more usable in case you want it to be direct descendants, not direct descendants, or not parents or parents. So let's say I had another container called right nav inside of it. This rule would not take effect. And this may seem kind of a weird ancillary property for now, but once you go into development, it's actually really useful. Surprisingly useful, actually. So yeah, just some more about the parent selector. Yeah, okay, so now we'll go to the code. Let me stop sharing and share the code really quickly. So here you can see the GitHub repo for this course. And so of course we won't be going through everything just because this is meant to be a 4-hour course and I'm only going to teach the first hours of it. So yeah, feel free, as I said, to go through all of these. But for now, we'll just go through the first 2 or 3. So we're going to start with, if you go into exercises and then parents, let's open that up. Start public, index.html, and let me open up the exercise. Yes, yeah, at this point, if there are any questions, feel free to drop something in the chat or just unmute yourself. Does Sass not work? Two. Wait, give me 1 minute. Sorry about that. I remember there's a special way of opening these that's not just open. Give me just 1 second to figure it out. All right, let me share screen again. Give me 1 second. Let me just make sure this works. All right, so I figured it out. My bad for not being super on top of this. Yeah, let me just share my screen again. Yeah, in order to run it, you need to go into the root directory and then do /run /run and then -e and then name the exercise. So we're gonna be starting with nesting, not parent. Oh, sorry about that. So see here is, let me start up the local host real quick, or let me go to the local host is what I mean. Awesome. Yeah, and you can kind of see here a little autograder. It is incorrect. This is kind of an oldish course, but you can tell if this matches what you want. So for exercise 1, these are the parameters, right? I'm not going to go through this in much detail. I'm just going to kind of show, I guess, the main. Also, I will, I guess, apologize right now. I did not know I was teaching tonight. I did not expect to teach tonight, so this is going to be kind of a put a hack together lesson, just to preface that. Let me think how to go about this. So what I'm going to do actually, is because I was kind of unprepared, is leave some of these exercises as homework and just go purely theoretical today. And I know it's not an ideal situation, but what I think I'll do is provide a very nice guide on how to go through it and have 1 or 2 of the exercises at least have solutions so you can have some references. So yeah, I guess, does that sound good to everybody? Sorry about not being a bit more prepared.
Where are these slides again?
Yeah, so let me, education notion. Let's close some of these actually. If you go to front end, and I'll put this on the syllabus soon with the recording right after. But if you go to front end, give it a second to load. Yeah, let me just move Sass over here. And UIX, I'll just go over here. I think that's correct. Yeah, if you go into Sass right here, that's pretty much the lesson, these slides. And I'll throw the GitHub repo here. I actually should have done that. I'll update it right after and send out the homework for everything with a guide and all that stuff tonight. So be on the lookout for that. But these slides are right here. I'll attach the GitHub repo. Actually, I'll do it right now. It's probably the easiest part. Wait, not embed. Yeah. So these slides are right here if you want to access them. Awesome. So yeah, this will be a theoretical lecture then. I'll probably show some examples, not this one just because I haven't actually looked at this stuff in like a couple months, I think. So I'll just show some examples of real Sass that I work with. That might be, I guess, better than trying to hack something together or like trying to understand code on the fly. Let me find some repos that I worked on. So this is something I'm working on right now. Please don't steal my code. It's proprietary code. Sass. Yes, let me show some real Sass. Or actually, let me just open. It's right here. CSS. No, it's image. So this is an example of CSS. Most people just use it for nesting. You can use some variables too. Like you can see here variable, but I will talk about that more in a second. But you can see here that this is a good example. So I have library filter, and right now you work with like pseudo classes, right? So you have the colon hover, so you want on hover. Typically how you'd write is library filter colon hover, right? But you don't want to do that in Sass because you typically want to have two classes, or like two classes that aren't like multiple very different classes on the same line. Use the parent selector here. So if you want .library filter and colon hover, then you just attach an ampersand right before it. And here I also want every paragraph tag inside library filter to have this kind of style. So that's where Sass comes in with nesting. So that's an example of some real Sass that I'm working with right now. And yeah, this is kind of next thing. We'll talk about variables. So let me go on to that. So before variables, I guess, let me hit importing. So how good architecture works, and I'm not really doing this in the example I showed you, just because it's just a bad practice. I don't really have an excuse for that. But what people typically do is store their variables in another file just for decentralization. And what I mean by that is, so let's say you have a site, right? And you want your paragraph tags to be white, you want your headers to be blue, you want your background to be purple. And that's kind of a theme around the site. So you'll need to like repeat it every time. If you were working in regular CSS, you'd probably have to repeat it every time for every class, right? That's not something you really want to do. And so you have a separate file, typically called underscore variables, just so you don't mess with anything else that might be called variables, just because it's a common name, it's a keyword. And you can import that file using @import. So this is just a declarative statement. And yeah, using import in CSS results in a new round trip HTTP request. I want to talk about network systems right now. But yeah, just having this good file structure is just what you typically do in big projects. For your final project, for example, you probably won't need to have a separate variables component just because you probably won't have over like 20,000 lines of code. That's when you start getting a lot bigger. That's when you might want to consider using these type of things. But if you have less than 20,000 pieces of lines of code, then you're probably fine just having regular CSS without having separate files for variables. That being said, variables are useful in other ways. Let me go back to variables. Yes. So how you declare a variable in Sass is a $, and then colon, and then the value. There are a couple different ways you can do it. If you have your variable declaration outside of any class, it's a global variable. You can use it anywhere. And it's kind of like functions versus local variables. You guys have learned that in 61A, like just having x equals 5 versus having x equals 5 in a function. It's kind of like that, where each class is kind of a function. So here we see text color is this. You can only use text color in alert error. However, you can use error color anywhere. So another thing you can have for overriding is exclamation default. And just in CSS, this exclamation mark is typically called a bang, so a bang default. So as it says, use this value unless error color is set elsewhere. So it's kind of the wildcard operator, like the star operator in CSS. You learned that a long time ago, so I'm sure some of you have forgotten, but that has the lowest priority out of any operator versus classes, IDs, all that stuff. And one more neat thing about Sass in terms of variables, it comes with built-in functions. So let's say I have text color, right? And I want to have a shadow that's 40% darker than it, but I don't actually know what hex code that would be. You have functions like darken, you have lighten, you have more than lighten and darken. I kind of forgot off the top of my head. Let me search actually. There are a lot. You typically only use lighten and darken for most purposes, but they have some really cool ones actually. Or not variables, Sass functions. Oops. Let me go back. This page might have something. Yeah. Let me see. Where are the functions? I can just search darken and see if it's on this page. Oh, here it is. So there's darken, lighten, variable functions. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Let me just go back and search Sass functions. Actually, that's probably a faster way if I can't find it here. Built-in modules. I think that's what I'm looking for, because you can define your own functions actually in Sass, which is something really cool. But I'm looking for a built-in. Oh yeah, they have .scale, they have transforms, they have HSL. I have no idea what that means, but it looks like it's something relevant to this. Oh, HSL is not just another way of defining colors versus RGB or hex. So I never use it personally, but some people do. They have ifs, they have control flow, but that's completely separate. But yeah, they have a lot. You can see here map, math, string. Let me open this. I'm looking for something very specific that I can't find. At rules. No, in that case, maybe I'm calling it the wrong thing, but we'll see. Go back to slides. But yeah, so you have variables. Now you can see here that I'm defining the background color to be this variable, and I'm using it here. I'm using darken actually right here. So you can tell from this code that I want the background to be this, and when I hover over the filter, it darkens by 10%. So that's one really handy use of Sass. It's a very straightforward use. It's not very nuanced as you can get with Sass, but it's a very clear example. If you want to hover over a button and you want the hover to do something, it's very easy to just throw a background there. And this way, let's say I decide to change let's say I decide to change the color of the button. I don't need to change it in two places, here and here. I can change it in one place. So that's another example of the dry principle. And just to reiterate, dry is a very common CSS principle called don't repeat yourself. Now to go back, I realized that for the underscore, just for importing files, it's not just because of variable names. It's for these files are called partials. I forgot about that. My bad. So these files don't compile to any CSS, and that's because you only have rules in them. Okay, you have background is this, you have word color is this, so it's just variables, or layout, or just general rules. They don't actually compile to CSS, and your compiler knows this because of the underscore beforehand. Sass compiler knows this. You import them in the actual CSS files that do turn into CSS files and are read by the compiler and applied to your HTML files. So that's, I guess, a reason for having underscored file names. And you also use that for graph CSS files. Like, let's say you have an experimental CSS file that kind of turning on and off, and you don't want to kind of delete it or comment it out or anything like that. You can just add an underscore to it before it, and it just won't be compiled. So that's a neat thing with Sass. And just going on. You can do simple arithmetic for values, which is actually really nice. If you want to do padding, instead of having 10 pixels, you can say 5 pixels plus 5 pixels, which doesn't seem big, but it's surprisingly useful. One of those also really surprisingly useful things. Sass can convert to units, and yeah, here's some examples. You can throw, Sass is much like JavaScript in that you can throw pretty much anything in there and it'll interpret it in some way without erroring. So comments, yeah, you do have single line comments in Sass, which is really nice. In CSS, you gotta do these really bulky things, but in Sass, you got the JavaScript like comments where you can do a // and that is really nice. A string interpolation, you can kind of tell from this. If you've worked with JavaScript, you know template literals, you have backtick, and then you have $sign brackets where you can put in a variable, or Python, you have like F and brackets your variables. Kind of like that. I haven't found that to be super useful, just a feature. Sass has a lot of really random features that aren't necessarily useful or used much. It's just kind of there. So here's another import. Another thing is mixins. So we go here. A mixin is another application to dry principle, so don't reuse code. So let's say you have alert text, right? And you have all this code here, and you repeat it a couple times. So you see here, you repeat an error text, and you repeat it, and it has error. And so you see, let's say you write these out manually. You see that these 3 lines of CSS are the same in both classes. And you typically wouldn't do this for 2 classes, but let's say 5, 6 classes where these 3 lines are repeated in every class. You can make this class a mixin. So it's pretty simple to do so. Just add an @mixin right before it, and it basically becomes a variable. So here you can see @include, the name the mixin. And what that basically does when it compiles is, I think there's a picture of it actually. No, okay, no picture. But what it basically does is at compile time, it takes alert text, finds it here, and just puts these 3 lines of CSS in here. So it's like, extremely equivalent. I know it is completely equivalent to just writing out these 3 lines of CSS here and here, but this just helps you as a developer write less. And you'll find this as a common theme amongst like advanced tools like TypeScript or Sass, Less, any of these tools that aren't just CSS, JavaScript, HTML. They don't actually help a ton. In fact, they always slow down your code just because your code actually needs to go through an extra compiler, and it just makes sense, right? You're doing an extra framework on top of something else that already works. You're basically just turning. It's kind of like Python versus C, or C++, I forget. Python is built on top of C or C++, so working in C++ is always faster. But Python is way more fun to type in. It's way more fun to work in, just because it's a lot less work. It's basically pseudocode, right? That's what Sass and TypeScript kind of are. So all these, they aren't, the only real reason for Sass's existence is to make your life easier. Everything you can do in Sass, you can do in CSS. It'd just be a lot of extra work. So yep, here is, yeah, mixins are a perfect example of that. They're super useful. You can also turn mixins into taking arguments. So here's where Sass's kind of comparison to functions come in. This is basically a function at this point. So let's say I want alert text, and let's say I have these 2 lines in common here for 5, 6 classes, and each of them has a background color, but some of them are different. Instead of just having background color be in each class and only taking these 2 lines out, you can make it a variable pretty easily. Like you can just see here, it's pretty much like a Python or Java variable, or like any language's variable really. It's passed in with parentheses. And yeah, just to note variable $sign right beforehand. So basically you're passing blue, color is equal to blue, and then you put that set into here. Pretty straightforward. And yeah, don't worry, I want to assign all these exercises homework only 2 or 3. They each take, like you can see right here, 10 minutes, so it should only take 30 minutes max. And I will also, yeah, include a detailed guide of how to like start them up. So just keep on going with mixins. You can have default values just like any other language. Sass becomes pretty like Python actually, but like a very stupid version of Python, as you will see. You can have arrays in Sass, but it's 1 index, so you know it's not a real programming language, but it's better than CSS, and that's what matters. But yeah, default argument values, pretty straightforward there. Null values, usually you really don't need, I guess, yeah, if you don't want any opacity, your opacity to be like different than what is default, then I guess you could have a null here. And in some cases, these are all just different ways to make your life easier and help you write less code. So instead of having to write foo null or foo 0 or foo 1, you can just have a null right here and it'll just automatically assume. And you can see right here that all this mixin code, all this Sass code just transpiles to this CSS code. So it's the same as writing it without all this stuff, but it just makes your life easier and helps you write code faster. I guess one more thing before I guess I'll take a break for questions. Declaration block. Yeah, this is kind of like a mixin, I guess. You can kind of like throw it in there. It's all this stuff, like this is getting into advanced mixins, as you can probably tell. It's not extremely useful per se, unless you have, as I said, a really huge code base and you're working like, let's say a front engineer at LinkedIn or front engineer at Facebook, then for sure you'd have to think a lot about these things. It's a lot of architecture, like how do you want to structure your variables, your mixins, all that stuff, but not super important day to day, not super important just in general. So yeah, I know that was a lot of stuff to throw at you. So are there any questions? Here are the functions I was looking for. Yeah, any questions? Which one is better in general? Do you like, which 2 are you referring to? CSS and Sass? Okay. I would say Sass, just because if you don't use any of the features of Sass, then it's the exact same as CSS. Like if you don't need to use mixins, you don't need to use imports, you don't need to use nesting. Like you can just treat like if you change a CSS file to SCSS, it still works. And yeah, you can just treat it like normal CSS. So I personally would rather use Sass. The only real reason you would use regular CSS is if maybe the rest of your code base is written in CSS and maybe changing it to Sass would be really wonky, or if you like have a very, very pressing need for speed. Most applications, like 99.9% of applications, don't need that increase in speed because it's pretty minuscule. If you're working on something, I'm not really sure of a use case to be honest, but yeah, if you like have a need for like very like 0.1% extra increase in speed, then go with CSS. Otherwise, go with Sass just because you don't need to use its features, and its features only help you go faster. So did that kind of answer the question? All right, awesome. Are there any other questions? All right. If there are none, then we'll move on. Give me a sec. Yeah, you can see some of the built-in functions here. Rgba, that is pretty useful if you have a bunch of like red, green, blue variables. Like let's say you have a site aesthetic, you can kind of mix and match the variables to get Rgba values. And red, green, and blue are actually super useful. Can't believe I forgot about those. Like you can get the red part of a color, green part of a color, blue part of a color, which also does come in surprisingly handy. And mix is also super handy. You can mix two colors together. So if you're just like, green and red, you want to be Christmassy, but you kind of want to be both, you can get something in the middle by just using mix. You can assign a weight here, and then that's an array. We'll get to arrays in just a couple of minutes. So yeah, color functions adjust hue is really nice. So I'm sure some of you have seen the color wheel at some point. You can adjust it by a couple of degrees in the color wheel. So that's actually pretty nice. Yeah, darken, lighten are two very common ones. Desaturate and saturate. If you've ever been to photography, use DSLR or something, use editing Lightroom, saturation, you know what saturation is. I'm not going to cover it in detail just because I don't fully understand what saturation is, to be quite honest. If anybody does, feel free to drop the definition of saturation in the chat, but it does that. Yeah. And yeah, color functions. Let me just see if there's anything else in here. All right, if not, let's keep on going. So this is where we start getting to the real power of Sass, and that's actual logic. So logic in CSS sounds crazy, right? Like CSS, making CSS like logic, like a declarative typing language or something like stupid like that. Like it's very interesting as a concept. But Sass did it, and it did surprisingly well. So yeah, a big part of any, I guess, logically typed language is a control flow. So here, as you can see, you have if, and all this kind of comes into play with all the other features. Like you don't really have an if like size is greater than 10 if you know that size is going to be greater than 10, because then there's no real need for an if statement. So all this stuff kind of comes into play with mixins for control flow, where you have variables that could change. So here you see pretty simply, like you have font size is the passing size for mixin no matter what. So it's like a pretty standard function. And then if the variable size is greater than 20, then you apply this. So you can see here an example of turning Sass into CSS. You include foo, which is 14 pixels. 14 pixels is less than 20. So you only apply font size is 14. Over here, 24 is greater than 20, so you apply both of these rules. So yeah, that's the first taste of magic with Sass. Nesting is honestly 90% of the magic. It is very nice. Nesting is just so useful. But this is where Sass becomes really magical. Yeah, if is pretty straightforward. I think you just do else if I remember. Let me double check actually. Sass if. Forget, I think it's at else. Yep, it's just if and at else if and then else. So yeah, I guess that's That's just exactly like Java. Yeah, so if you've worked with Java, it's exactly that. Just remember the at right beforehand. All right. So then you have a for loop. So this is where the syntax is kind of wonky. So at for, whatever your variable is, from 1 through 5. And Sass is inclusive. So if you say 1 through 5, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so that's just the first of its kind of weirdness. And here you can see H, where the ID is whatever I is. So if the ID is H, so actually let me take a step back. So let's say you want your font size for different headers to be very specific, right? So H1 is 20 rems, H2 is 15 rems, and let's say so on, right? So a very standard pattern. Then this is where for loops come in. And this is kind of, just to clarify, define the global scope. So not inside a class or a mixin or anything. So as you can see here, this is string interpolation. So kind of like the $, curly bracket, variable, close curly bracket. Here, I think it's just better to walk through an example actually. So what this will do is assign I to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's start with the first case, right? I is 1. What will happen is H1, because this evaluates to a variable, the hashtag curly brackets know that whatever's inside of curly brackets is a variable. And here in the first run through of it, we assign I to 1. So this will become H1. And the font size will equal to 5 rem minus, so 0.75, so 4.25. So what this will create is H1 font size 4.25 rem. As you can see here, their equivalent CSS is right here. So this does the same for I is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see right here that we've successfully created H1, H2, H3, H4, H5 with different font sizes. So instead of having to manually write each class and maybe get it wrong, you can just kind of create a control statement. And this is pretty powerful alone, just for 5 for loop iterations. But once you start using it for variables and multiple iterations and just really big scale things, it becomes super nice to have. So you can also have data structures. You can have a list. So you define a list without brackets. I think you can also do with brackets. Not 100% on that though. But yeah, just pretty simple, right? Box shadow right here. Yeah, and here you can see another example of string interpolation. We use ent. Ent is actually another very important function. It's also in regular CSS, but in different form, where you get the third thing from my list. So as you can see here, this is my list. So anybody have any guesses as to what the third thing in my list will be? If we run this command, what will this evaluate to? And I'm sure some of you already saw it. Yep, 2 pixels. Just because Sass is 1 index, so 1, 2, 3, 4. But yeah, 2 pixels. Oh, we're right on the money. So going forward, some more directives. You have at each. So this is kind of like a for each loop. So if you've done 61A, you have like for I in list, which would just go through every element in the list, versus for I in like range len list, right, which goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to len of list. Now -1 inclusive. So yeah, you have for and an each. Instead of having a for each, you just have an each. So for each I in my list, you would just have a comment with that. So you can see right here, 0, 0, 2 pixels, and hashtag 0, 0, 0. So pretty straightforward. And here is nth, as I mentioned. This gets the second element of whatever you pass it in, or the ith element. So it would be nth of the list, comma, position. So for this right here, I think this is a 2D array. Pretty sure. Couldn't be honest, not 100% sure. That's kind of my bad. I'm pretty sure it's a 2D array. I will say that. All right. You know, it's a 2D array. Just looking at this a little bit further, this is definitely a 2D array. So yeah, just parentheses around it just because you use your regular commas in your CSS sometimes, and just pretty straightforward. So no brackets at the moment, but yeah, pretty sure you can also have brackets. Next, you have maps. So getting even more fun, you can have a map that maps a function onto a list. Yeah, that's what map does. I haven't defined map in a long time. But yeah, So basically, it's kind of like a hash map. My bad. It's not a map function like Python. It's, if you don't know what a hash map is, basically it's a key value pair. So like a Python dictionary, or like just kind of like a key value pair, right? So index 0 would, if you have a list, just a regular like 1D list, with like 5, 6, 7, 8, right? You could imagine the list, the key value pair is being mapping the index 0 to 5, mapping the index 1 to 6. And that is how lists work, right? They map each index when you pass in an index to its corresponding value. So in that case, the key would be the index and the value would be the actual value in the list. That's just a really quick and dirty introduction to key value pairs. There's a lot there. Basically what this does is you map get, right? My map t. So here you want dark value. So this would give back the 009, and here you want the light value. So this would pass back 6xf. So this is kind of how you get, let's say you don't know what dark and light is, you just kind of like, here I want a dark color and here I want a light color. This is kind of like a small step up from variables. You could typically replace maps with variables, but it just kind of depends on what kind of architecture you want. All right, so now we've actually covered a lot of Sass, to be quite frank. Are there any questions at this point? I'll give it a minute in case anyone has questions. I know I've covered a lot of things without any example, which is my bad. Let me see if I can find an example of some Sass real quick, actually. It might be helpful. Let's say search. Let's see if the Sass site has some good examples. And yeah, just to, I guess, solidify this, I will send out the homework. So as you can see here, you are including a mixin within a mixin. You can do that if you just want some nice double layered choosy type stuff. And here you include it. So just remember the at is a declarative in Sass. You have a string literal here where you have hashtag, curly brackets, much like in Python F or in JavaScript $, stuff like that, and variable inside there. Let's see. Yes, I guess we have 25 minutes left. I'll just hit one more part and maybe you can end a little bit early. Yeah, sorry for that. I'll work out the example things just for the homework. BEM, you can kind of see what it stands for here. CSS Design Philosophies, I'm not a big fan of, to be honest. I just want to write less CSS. It's always the goal, and if a design philosophy helps me get there, then it's good. I know a lot of people think a lot about design philosophy when it comes to CSS and code philosophy. I'm not really one of those people, but if you are, there's a whole world of things for you to look at. Just let me know if you're interested in that stuff. I'll report that stuff to you. But yeah, I already talked about the dry principle. That's the main one. It's pretty straightforward. You know, don't repeat yourself. That's what functions are for in pretty much any coding language. BEM is a lot more CSS specific, as you can see here. But yeah, I won't cover it too much other than just acknowledging that it exists. So going along. Right, there are some weird things with BEM actually in CSS. There's underscores and dashes. I don't know what they mean. I quite honestly forgot, and I've never used them. But yeah, there are more the advanced stuff that I don't think is super useful unless you want to. So let me look at style reuse, add extend. So yeah, I guess add extend is another declarative I can talk about. It I'm gonna define it. So you have like right here, right? Dot danger, btn button danger, alert danger. So extend is kind of like doing that. It's not actually placing this CSS code in the class that you're extending it from. It's saying if you have button danger, if you want to like apply it separately. That's the best way to talk about extend is in terms of the CSS looking at it, it's equivalent to putting all this stuff in here, right? As you can see here, you apply all these two lines of CSS to button danger and alert danger anyways. So it doesn't really make a huge difference. I think that's something to do with compile time. And it's like a very oddly specific feature. Okay, I think I'm, to be honest, getting into the place where stuff is not super helpful. Let me see, is there anything on functions? There is function, okay. So this is the last thing I'll talk about just because all of these really weird stuff with extend and percentages are not useful. I mean, they can be, but there's a very rare chance that they actually show up. The last useful part of Sass that I will talk about is functions. So I already saw a type of function in Mixin. However, actual functions are a little bit different. So they do follow a very standard control flow. You define a function and you define what type it is. So you can tell already, like it's kind of like Java where you declare what type it is, a double int string, and you take in a variable. And here you return math, right? You return 2 times the variable x with an @return declarative. So here, let's say you have w, right? 2 pixels. So here you want 2 times whatever the width is, then that's what this function is for. And you can see equivalent CSS. Instead of having to do math manually, let's say you don't actually know what the width is, or you don't want to know what the width is, you just want to know it's 3 times this for this section. So you just do double or triple that. I don't think there's any such thing as Lambda functions in Sass. I might be wrong. I'm not super advanced into Sass, not be a really niche feature, but I don't think there are Lambda functions or like one-liner functions if you aren't sure what Lambda functions are. So yeah, here's another super helpful example of a function. Let's say you have like a mix of red, green, and blue, and depending on the values, like let's say you want to get the overpowering value. So as you can see here, if red is greater than both, so if red is the biggest component of a color, you only return red. Similarly for green and blue. So yeah, it's another example of a function. You can do a lot of stuff with functions. That, as I said, is mostly for, it's really helpful for writing less code, but you need to really think about them before you start writing CSS, because it is time consuming to write regular CSS and then turn into Sass. It's really easy to nest things, but in terms of creating mixins, functions, variables, all that stuff, it is really time consuming if you don't do it from the start. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't started coding your final project yet, or if you're just in the beginning stages, like you only have 1 or 2 CSS files that are actually built out, to switch to Sass. And just really quickly, in case you don't know how to use Sass in React, you can't just use an SCSS file because then then your compiler won't know what it is. You have to npm install node-sass. You can see right here is the command, and then you can work with Sass. Pretty straightforward. Just a quick reminder, you have to actually download that as an npm package. All right, let me just see if there's anything else that's important at all. All right, that should be it. So I know this was a really hacked together presentation. I will be sending out homework tonight, or if not tonight, by the end of the weekend, and I'll give a due date of probably 1-2 weeks. I'll let you guys know an announcement in the Slack when that comes out and what the due date is. But yeah, thank you for coming. Are there any questions? If not, feel free to leave. That was it. Let me stop recording. Yeah, once again, thank you all for coming out, and sorry for the delay and just general confusion. Yeah, I would highly recommend you all use Sass in your final project.